Before 24 million viewers in the White House press room, Donald Trump slammed Barack Obama as unfit and promised a recording that would end his legacy. But when Obama's steady voice echoed through the speakers for nearly 7 minutes, what was meant to be a takedown became a moment of unity. In a nation split down the middle, will America remember the outrage or the hope? In the next few seconds, you will witness the truth that they never wanted the public to know. The White House press room had never felt so small. Cameras hummed like restless insects, their red lights burning holes into the air, while 24 million Americans leaned forward behind their television screens waiting. Reporters gripped their pens as though they were weapons eyes darting across the room, whispering rumors of a storm about to break. The walls seemed to vibrate with a tension that no one could name, a silence loaded with the weight of anticipation. Then the doors opened and Donald Trump entered like a man ready to set fire to history. He didn't pause. He didn't soften his step. His face carried the sharp confidence of someone convinced he was about to pull the rug from under a nation. Barack Obama was unfit. Then he declared, his voice slicing the room, and he's unfit now. The words cracked like thunder. They bounced off the polished podium and lodged in every chest. Eyebrows lifted, pens froze, and the entire front row leaned forward, as if daring him to continue. This wasn't the usual barrage of insults. It carried a deadly promise, a warning shot that something bigger was on its way. Every detail fed the sense of drama. The fluorescent lights above cast shadows too sharp, turning Trump's face into a mask of certainty. The Washington Post reporter in the first row felt her pulse quicken as she asked, "Mr. President, are you saying Obama is actively working against your administration?" Trump's jaw tightened, the silence stretched, and then he nodded slowly, deliberately, like a general confirming the start of war. "That's exactly what I'm saying. He's been undermining everything we've built, but today, you'll hear it for yourself." The promise hung in the air like the ticking of a countdown clock. Reporters exchanged glances, the electricity between them almost visible. Some scribbled furiously, their notes breaking into jagged lines, while others simply froze, caught between skepticism and dread. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just another insult hurled across a political divide. It was a performance, a live demonstration meant to shatter reputations. And yet something about the way Trump delivered it felt almost theatrical, like an actor confident that the next scene would bring the house down. The cameramen adjusted their angles, zooming in, chasing the sweat beading at the edge of his brow, the gleam in his narrowed eyes. Then, with the precision of a conductor calling his orchestra to life, Trump raised one hand. The room fell silent. A staffer appeared from the wings carrying a sleek black laptop like it was a weapon locked in steel. Trump tapped the microphone once, sharp, deliberate, a signal that the moment of revelation had come. His fingers curled toward the laptop, and with a smirk that looked carved into his face, he gestured to the machine. "You'll hear it for yourself." The air collapsed into silence, heavier than any applause. Every camera tilted forward, every pen froze mid-air, every heartbeat quickened, as though the room itself knew it was standing at the edge of a cliff. What would follow was unknown, but one truth was undeniable. This wasn't just another headline. This was the beginning of a story America would never forget. The speakers crackled like distant thunder, jagged static, cutting through the air as every eye locked on the podium. For a breathless second, nothing. Then a voice, calm, steady, unmistakable: Barack Obama. The sound rolled across the press room like a tide, soft but commanding, filling every corner with a weight no one expected. "Thank you all for being here today," the voice began, measured, unhurried, carrying the rhythm of a man who never needed to raise his tone to be heard. Reporters froze. They had braced for venom, for betrayal caught on tape, but instead what flowed from the speakers was something else entirely. Obama spoke of uncertainty, of young leaders searching for meaning, of how every small act, mentoring a child, reminding a neighbor they mattered, was a brick laid in the foundation of democracy. The words landed like raindrops on a dry desert, soaking into a room primed for fire. Pens lowered, cameras stilled, breaths softened into silence. It wasn't scandal they were hearing. It was leadership reborn in real time. Trump leaned back, arms folded, a smirk tugging at his mouth, as though daring the room to see weakness where none existed. His confidence radiated like neon heat, certain the words would twist into proof of betrayal. But the contrast was blinding. Obama's voice painted visions of resilience of teachers in Detroit, refusing to give up on students, of parents in Milwaukee working 3 jobs to keep the lights on. These were not the words of a man undermining a nation. They were the words of a man reminding people why the nation was worth fighting for. Confusion thickened into awe. A cameraman, stone-faced after years of White House briefings, whispered without meaning to, "This is moving." A journalist in the back row pressed her notebook shut, no longer writing, only listening. The irony rippled across the room like a slow explosion. What had been promised as a bombshell was transforming into a bomb, healing old wounds instead of tearing new ones open. And still the voice continued, unwavering. Our democracy survives not because of one leader, but because of millions of voices refusing to give up on one another. The words echoed in the sterile air, pulling hearts upward, even as tension coiled tighter around the man at the podium. Trump's smirk widened, but the unease flickered in his eyes. He believed he was detonating a weapon. The rest of the room knew they were hearing a sermon. The silence that followed was electric, like the split second before lightning strikes. Reporters glanced at one another. Brows furrowed, lips parted their expressions, asking a single unspoken question. If this was the evidence, then what game was really being played? A ripple of murmurs cut through the stillness, first soft, then swelling like the hum of a storm gathering strength. Reporters leaned toward one another, their whispers sharp enough to slice the silence. "This isn't incriminating," one breathed, pen frozen in midair. "It's presidential." The words spread like sparks through dry brush, impossible to contain igniting glances of disbelief and quiet awe. Trump's smirk held for a moment longer, but then his jaw twitched, the mask of certainty straining. He slammed his hand against the podium, voice pitched higher than before. "That's weakness, not leadership." The declaration rang through the chamber, brittle as if it might shatter on contact with the air. Instead of thunder, it sounded like desperation, an echo bouncing off walls that refused to answer back. Reporters didn't nod, didn't scribble, didn't buy the spin. They only stared, eyes flicking between the man at the podium and the voice still flowing from the speakers. Obama's words kept coming steady and relentless, every syllable a contrast sharp enough to wound. He spoke of neighbors in Flint checking in on one another, of democracy as a living covenant, of the courage to believe when cynicism told you not to. His tone was a tide lifting the room higher with every sentence. A CNN correspondent muttered under his breath, "If this is the best he's got, this could backfire." Another, barely containing a smirk, whispered, "He just handed Obama free airtime." The irony thickened until it was almost suffocating. Trump had come armed with a recording he thought would bury his rival, but the tape had become a resurrection, a reminder of a steadiness the nation had almost forgotten. Cameras zoomed in on his face, catching the flicker of unease beneath the forced confidence, the beads of sweat forming at his temple under the merciless lights. Every second, Obama's voice filled the room. Trump shrank, not in stature, but in presence, his authority undercut by the very evidence he believed would destroy. One journalist dared to break the silence, her voice deliberate. "Mr. President, with respect, this doesn't sound like undermining. It sounds like encouragement." A wave of murmurs followed the press corps, no longer hiding their skepticism. Trump leaned forward, gripping the podium, eyes flashing. "Encouragement is weakness. We need strength, not lectures about families or neighbors." But the fire in his words felt hollow, like a match struck in the rain. The tape rolled on, ignoring the fury at the podium, Obama's voice carrying a final line that seemed to reverberate through the bones of the room. "Leadership isn't about tearing others down. It's about lifting people up so they can carry the torch when you're gone." The sentence landed like a hammer, not of destruction, but of clarity. Reporters sat back in their chairs, stunned, realizing they were watching not the unmasking of Obama, but the unraveling of Trump. The room pulsed with irony, disbelief hanging thick in the air. And in that moment, a question hovered unspoken above every camera lens and every frozen pen. When someone hands their opponent the microphone, who really owns the moment? The press room was still trembling with the echo of Obama's final words when the real explosion began, not in Washington, but in the endless sprawl of glowing screens across America. Within minutes, clips of the recording were clipped, stitched, and fired into the bloodstream of Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, like sparks thrown into dry grass. A shaky phone capture from the back of the briefing room hit 1 million views in under 10 minutes. The hashtags multiplied at breakneck speed, hashtag strengthen words, hashtag Obama tape, burning their way up trending charts with the ferocity of a wildfire no spin team could control. On TikTok, creators layered Obama's calm voice over montages of grocery clerks, stocking shelves at dawn nurses, pulling double shifts in crowded ERs and teachers writing lessons in half-lit classrooms. The cadence of his words matched perfectly with images of ordinary grit, ordinary sacrifice, ordinary hope. A single video, Obama's line leadership, isn't about tearing others down, laid over footage of a mother lacing up her son's worn-out sneakers, hit 5 million views before the White House even released its first official statement. The internet wasn't dissecting. It was amplifying, multiplying, breathing new life into every syllable. Twitter X lit up like a battlefield of words and disbelief. Politicians tweeted statements. Comedians fired off one-liners, but none of it could outrun the raw clip itself. A teenager in Detroit tweeted simply, "I was in that room when he said this." It felt real then. It feels even more real now. 30,000 retweets later, her voice became part of the storm, a chorus echoing from coast to coast. The hashtags weren't just numbers climbing on a screen. They were pulses markers of a country suddenly caught in a conversation it hadn't expected to have. Instagram Reels added a sheen of nostalgia. Slow-motion footage of high school graduations, of firefighters leaving their stations, of veterans saluting folded flags, all paired with Obama's line. Our democracy survives because millions refuse to give up on one another. Comment sections filled faster than moderators could manage. This gave me chills. Say what you want about politics, but this feels like leadership. We needed this reminder. For the first time in years, the internet wasn't tearing itself apart. It was pausing, listening, remembering. Meanwhile, Trump's team tried to push their own clips, desperate to frame the tape as weakness, but their posts drowned beneath a tidal wave of resonance. Algorithms favored authenticity over spin, and the authenticity had a face, a voice, in a rhythm that people still craved. Every time the president typed out "unfit" in capital letters, the reply threads flooded with Obama's words, clipped into memes, remixed into soundtracks, stitched into prayers of a different kind. The battlefield was digital, but the outcome was already visible. In the space of a single afternoon, what was supposed to be a dagger became a torch carried not by politicians, but by millions of ordinary Americans replaying a voice they thought they had lost. And as the sun set on that day, glowing screens across the country pulsed with the same question whispered in living rooms, classrooms, and barbershops alike. Was this really weakness? Or was it exactly the strength they had been missing? The clip didn't just live online. It broke into living rooms, kitchens, and roadside diners, carried on televisions, radios, and phones balanced on counters, sticky with spilled coffee. In Toledo, Ohio, a truck driver named Alan Pierce sat heavy in his recliner boots, still dusted with the grit of the highway. He gripped the remote like a steering wheel, eyes locked on CNN as Obama's voice replayed. "History isn't written by cynics." Alan muttered, half to himself, half to the woman folding laundry beside him. "I didn't even vote for the guy. But damn, that sounds like a leader." His wife Carol didn't answer, just kept folding shirts, her eyes softening as she glanced at the screen. In Phoenix, Arizona, a high school senior named Danielle Morales sat cross-legged on the living room rug, phone buzzing in her palm. She played the tape aloud for her mother, the small apartment suddenly filled with Obama's calm cadence. Her mom chopping vegetables at the counter froze mid-slice, the knife hovering above the cutting board. Danielle whispered almost like a confession, "This is what my teacher keeps telling us, that we matter." Her mother turned slowly, towel in hand, and for a moment the weariness in her face cracked into something lighter, something that looked dangerously close to hope. Far away in Florida, in a retirement community lined with quiet streets and golf carts, a group of retirees gathered around a flat screen in the clubhouse. Some leaned forward in wheelchairs, others sipped iced tea from plastic cups, the hum of the AC drowning beneath Obama's words. "Our democracy survives because millions refuse to give up on one another." One man scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. It's just words. Pretty speeches don't fix the cost of groceries. But across from him, a widow in a pale blue dress whispered, maybe not, but at least it reminds us what we're supposed to believe in. The room fell into uneasy silence, not agreement, but not dismissal either. At lunch counters across the Midwest, the debate grew louder, voices rising above the hiss of fryers and the clatter of plates. In a diner off Route 66, four truckers leaned across their booth, arguing between mouthfuls of eggs and bacon. One slammed his mug down so hard the coffee splashed. Don't you get it? He's still trying to control the country. Another shook his head, stirring sugar into his cup. Or maybe he's just telling us not to give up on each other. Doesn't sound so bad to me. The waitress, balancing 3 plates in one hand, muttered without looking up. Sounds better than what I've been hearing lately. The table fell quiet, each man chewing slower, the fight fading into thought. Across America, the pattern repeated: barbershops, factory, lunchrooms, classrooms after the final bell. Some called it manipulation, others called it inspiration, but no one ignored it. For once, people weren't scrolling past the noise. They were stopping listening and arguing because the words had cut deep enough to demand a response. And in that rare pause, as divided voices tangled across counters and couches, a fragile thread of unity shimmered, not in agreement, but in the simple act of caring enough to debate at all. Hashtag 2.3 Media Storm. By nightfall, the clip was no longer just a trending hashtag, it was the lead story on every major network. Cable anchors leaned into their microphones, voices low and urgent as screens split into two on one side. Obama's calm, unwavering cadence. On the other, Trump's stiff face at the podium, eyes flashing with defiance. The contrast played on loop, a rhythm of irony the public couldn't look away from. MSNBC called it a backfire for the ages, CNN labeled it Obama's resurrection, and even Fox News anchors were split, some defending Trump, others admitting the words didn't sound like sabotage, they sounded like hope. Control rooms buzzed like beehives in crisis. Producers barked orders, run the clip again, side-by-side shot, get analysts on now, while headlines screamed across lower thirds, from proof to backfire, Obama reborn on tape, strength in words. Analysts filled panels with furrowed brows and incredulous laughter, one shaking his head as he muttered on live television. This was supposed to bury Obama. It resurrected him. The phrase exploded across social feeds within minutes, stamped on memes stitched into TikToks, replayed until it became prophecy. Inside the White House, the mood couldn't have been more different. Trump stalked the West Wing halls, rage snapping at every step, aides scattering like shadows under floodlights. Why are they replaying it? He shouted, slamming a fist against a desk. It's proof. Proof he's weak. But even his own staff shifted uncomfortably, eyes glued to the coverage. They couldn't stop. In one corner, a young aide whispered to another, "The more we fight it, the stronger it looks." The whisper carried like smoke, thin but undeniable. Meanwhile, the public absorbed the images with something close to reverence. Families huddled closer to their televisions, the same 7 minutes replaying again and again, but each time it felt heavier, more electric, more impossible to ignore. In diners, the chatter stilled when the audio came on. In gyms, runners slowed their treadmills to listen. In subway cars, strangers pulled out earbuds and turned up the volume on their phones. The words had broken free of politics. They had become something closer to music, resonating in spaces where speeches rarely mattered. Late-night comedians sharpened their knives, monologues dripping with irony. One host grinned at his audience and said, "Trump tried to drop a bomb on Obama, but it turned out to be a mixtape of hope." The audience roared laughter, tumbling into applause, and the clip replayed once more on the giant screen behind him. By morning, the joke itself was trending, folding back into the chaos of the storm. The narrative had slipped beyond anyone's grasp, transformed into a question larger than party lines, larger than spin do. Words gain more power when they're unexpected or when they're forbidden. By nightfall, the clip was no longer just a trending hashtag. It was the lead story on every major network. Cable anchors leaned into their microphones, voices low and urgent as screens split into two, on one side Obama's calm, unwavering cadence. On the other, Trump's stiff face at the podium, eyes flashing with defiance. The contrast played on loop, a rhythm of irony the public couldn't look away from. MSNBC called it a backfire for the ages, CNN labeled it Obama's resurrection, and even Fox News anchors were split, some defending Trump, others admitting the words didn't sound like sabotage. They sounded like hope. Control rooms buzzed like beehives in crisis. Producers barked orders, run the clip again. Side-by-side shot, get analysts on now, while headlines screamed across lower thirds, from proof to backfire, Obama reborn on tape, strength in words. Analysts filled panels with furrowed brows and incredulous laughter, one shaking his head as he muttered on live television. This was supposed to bury Obama, it resurrected him. The phrase exploded across social feeds within minutes, stamped on memes, stitched into TikToks, replayed until it became prophecy. Inside the White House, the mood couldn't have been more different. Trump stalked the West Wing hall's rage, snapping at every step, aides scattering like shadows under floodlights. "Why are they replaying it?" he shouted, slamming a fist against a desk. "It's proof. Proof he's weak," but even his own staff shifted uncomfortably, eyes glued to the coverage they couldn't stop. In one corner, a young aide whispered to another, "The more we fight it, the stronger it looks." The whisper carried like smoke, thin but undeniable. Meanwhile, the public absorbed the images with something close to reverence. Families huddled closer to their televisions, the same 7 minutes replaying again and again. But each time it felt heavier, more electric, more impossible to ignore. In diners, the chatter stilled when the audio came on. In gyms, runners slowed their treadmills to listen. In subway cars, strangers pulled out earbuds and turned up the volume on their phones. The words had broken free of politics. They had become something closer to music, resonating in spaces where speeches rarely mattered. Late-night comedians sharpened their knives, monologues dripping with irony. One host grinned at his audience and said Trump tried to drop a bomb on Obama, but it turned out to be a mixtape of hope. The audience roared laughter, tumbling into applause, and the clip replayed once more on the giant screen behind him. By morning, the joke itself was trending, folding back into the chaos of the storm. The narrative had slipped beyond anyone's grasp, transformed into a question larger than party lines. Larger than spin-do, words gain more power when they're unexpected or when they're forbidden. The storm outside was digital, but inside the West Wing, it was flesh and fury. Trump paced the carpet of the Oval Office like a caged animal, his face flushed, his hands clenched into fists that never stopped moving. Televisions on the walls replayed the same loop, Obama's calm voice layered over his own scowl, and each repetition felt like a personal insult carved into his skin. "Turn it off," he barked, but no one moved because even muted the image lingered heavy as smoke after an explosion. Advisors huddled in tight clusters, voices hushed, eyes darting to the door as though afraid their words might be caught and weaponized. One senior aide whispered, "We gave him a platform," his tone bitter with disbelief. Another shook her head, papers trembling in her hands. "No, we gave him a pulpit and the people turned it into one." Panic threaded through every corner of the room. Laptops glowed with live polls showing Obama's approval numbers, spiking the lines, climbing like a graph that refused to stop. Phones buzzed without mercy, donors demanding answers, lawmakers begging for direction. Trump slammed his palm against the resolute desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "They twist everything I gave them proof, and they crowned him instead." His voice was raw, edged with a desperation that sent aides stiffening in their chairs. Denial pulsed through his words, a refusal to see what was already visible on every glowing screen in America. "It's weakness," he roared. "They're making weakness look like strength." But even as he said it, he could see in the eyes of his staff that they no longer believed. In the Roosevelt Room, a hastily convened war council unfolded. Advisors threw talking points across the table like broken glass, none sharp enough to cut through the tide outside. "Frame it as interference," one urged. "Say he's meddling in national affairs." But another snapped back. "That tape doesn't sound like meddling, it sounds like leadership. People aren't buying it." The argument spiraled, voices climbing the air, thick with fear that smelled faintly of sweat and cold coffee. No one wanted to be the one to tell him the truth. The narrative had slipped beyond their grasp. Trump stormed back into the room, tie-loosened hair damp with sweat, his fury crackling like live wire. "Spin it harder," he growled. "Flood the networks. Drown him out." But the silence that followed was worse than dissent. It was the silence of people who knew the fight was already lost. Outside those walls, the voice of his rival was spreading like fire, uncontained, unstoppable. And inside, the man who lit the match could only rage as his own blaze consumed him. The West Wing felt less like the center of power and more like a sinking ship, every corridor echoing with the same unspoken dread. They had tried to bury Obama, and instead they had resurrected him. Far from the fevered corridors of Washington, the mood inside a modest office on Chicago's South Side was different, calmer, but no less electric. Barack Obama sat at a simple oak table in the Obama Foundation headquarters, sleeves rolled neatly at his wrists, his expression steady while the world outside erupted. Screens glowed with headlines. "Backfire of the year strengthened words, Obama reborn," but he barely looked at them. Instead, he listened, hands steepled, as his advisors pressed in, with voices sharp and urgent, the panic in their tone echoing the chaos consuming the West Wing. "Mr. President, you need to respond fast," one aide insisted, leaning forward, the tension in her shoulders coiled like wire. Another chimed in. "They're framing it their way already. If you don't speak soon, they'll fill the silence with spin." The words collided in the air, heavy with urgency, the room vibrating with a kind of restrained panic. They wanted action, a counterpunch, a headline to match the storm. But Obama didn't move. His gaze was steady, his breathing slow, as though he could hear something they couldn't, the deeper rhythm beneath the noise. Finally, he spoke, his tone low, but cutting through the frenzy like a blade. "If I respond," he said, pausing just long enough to let the silence stretch, "it won't be about me. It will be about the country." The words landed with weight, silencing the room more effectively than any command. His advisors blinked, caught between relief and frustration, knowing that restraint was his signature, but also knowing restraint could be dangerous in a world addicted to immediacy. Still, the way he said it carried an authority that couldn't be argued, with a reminder that strategy wasn't always about speed. Sometimes it was about timing. Outside the tall windows, the Chicago skyline glittered against a fading sun, indifferent to the storm-consuming Washington. Inside, Obama leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as if in prayer, while aides exchanged nervous glances. One whispered, "The longer he waits, the more they'll project their own meaning." Another answered softly, "Maybe that's exactly what he wants." The uncertainty hung heavy, but in Obama's calm posture, there was no hesitation. Only the quiet conviction of a man who understood that silence could be louder than fury. The hum of phones and the chatter of cable networks leaked faintly from the hallway, a reminder of the world clamoring for his voice. But Obama's patience filled the room like oxygen, pulling his staff into his gravity, whether they wanted it or not. This wasn't retreat, it was strategy. Restraint sharpened into power, waiting for the right moment to strike, not with volume, but with precision. And in that quiet Chicago office, while Washington drowned in noise, the contrast became a weapon of its own. The former president's calm was not passivity, it was positioning a stillness that turned into tension, a silence that felt like the pause before a decisive move. The clock struck 8 in Chicago and millions of screens flickered to life. No stage lights, no crowd, no applause, just Barack Obama seated at a simple desk, a stack of books behind him, a lamp casting warm light across his face. The stillness was startling, almost cinematic, as if the entire nation had stumbled into an intimate moment not meant for them. For a country bracing for fireworks, what they found instead was quiet, steady, deliberate disarming. He leaned forward slightly, hands folded, and began with the calm cadence that had once carried him into the presidency. "Over the past few days," he said, "a recording of mine has been shared widely. It wasn't meant for the world stage. It was a conversation with young leaders in Detroit, a reminder that their voices matter." His tone was not defensive, not angry, but something far more dangerous to his critics, measured human, undeniable. The chaos in Washington felt miles away, drowned beneath the weight of 8 minutes that demanded listening, not shouting. As the words flowed, living rooms across America fell silent. Obama spoke of democracy as a trust passed between neighbors, not a weapon wielded by the loudest voice. He spoke of leadership not as domination, but as presence, as listening. Then came the line that would ricochet across networks, stitched into headlines before the live stream even ended. Leadership isn't volume, it's listening. The phrase hung in the air like a bell tolling, unmistakable, unforgettable, a verdict without ever naming the man it condemned. In the West Wing, staffers huddled around muted televisions, the glow of the live stream flickering across their uneasy faces. Trump stormed from room to room, demanding counters, demanding headlines, demanding noise. But the contrast was merciless. Obama didn't need to shout. He didn't even need to mention his rival. His silence on Trump's name was its own blade razor-sharp cutting, deeper than accusation ever could. Back on the stream, Obama leaned closer, eyes steady, as if he were speaking directly to each viewer alone. We don't move forward by tearing each other down. We move forward by lifting one another up. The cadence was simple, almost too simple, but it carried the weight of something people hadn't heard in years: hope, unforced hope, without spectacle. For parents, for workers, for students who had only known chaos in politics, the restraint was the revelation. When the 8 minutes ended, the screen faded to black. No fireworks, no follow-up, no grand finale, just silence. And yet that silence carried further than any roar. Across kitchens, dorms, and diners, Americans sat back breathless, left with a question echoing louder than the speech itself. Is true strength revealed in what we fight or in what we refuse to fight? The glow of televisions and phones followed Obama's 8-minute stream like a ghost slipping into kitchens and coffee shops where America's heartbeats lived. At a dinner table in Madison, Wisconsin, a family of 5 sat in heavy silence as the replay echoed from the screen above the counter. Plates of half-eaten potatoes and green beans cooled, while a teenage daughter leaned forward, eyes sharp, and asked, "Why doesn't the president talk like that?" Her father, a lifelong Republican, stabbed at his food without looking up, muttering, "Steady doesn't mean right." But the edge in his voice betrayed something more fragile than anger. It was doubt. Across the country, in Boston, a coffee shop buzzed with the clash of espresso machines and conversation. College students huddled around laptops, earbuds shared between friends, the recording spilling into the air like a sermon. A young man in a Red Sox cap shook his head slowly, whispering, "I wasn't even old enough to vote for him." But this feels like what leadership is supposed to sound like. His grandmother, seated beside him with a paperback novel, lifted her eyes and smiled faintly. "It sounds like how it used to feel," she said, her voice trembling with memory. For a moment, the generations met in the same silence, bound by the rhythm of a voice neither of them could ignore. In Houston, a single mother stood at her stove stirring pasta sauce while her son scrolled TikTok at the kitchen table. The clip played again, Obama's line threading through the air. "Leadership isn't volume, it's listening." The boy looked up, earnest, his voice carrying the weight of innocence. "Mom, why don't they all talk like that?" She froze, spoon hovering midair, unable to answer. The question sank deeper than any speech, pressing into the space between exhaustion and hope, reminding her of what had been missing for so long. Meanwhile, in a diner off Route 40, retirees argued over steaming mugs of coffee while waitresses topped off cups without asking. One man in a plaid shirt slammed his palm against the Formica table. "Words don't pay bills," he barked, but the woman across from him, her hair silver and her hands clasped tight around the mug, answered softly, "Maybe not, but words remind us why we fight to pay them." The table went quiet, the clatter of plates around them suddenly louder, as if the room itself was listening. From kitchen tables to coffee counters, from teenagers with questions too sharp for easy answers, to elders holding on to echoes of steadier days, the tape became more than a political moment. It became a mirror, forcing families to see each other across divides they had stopped trying to bridge. For once, the conversation wasn't about sides, it was about what kind of voice they wanted guiding them forward. And in that pause, beneath the noise of forks and coffee spoons, a nation wrestled with the question together. The words traveled beyond kitchen tables, spilling into the very arteries of American life, factories, classrooms, and churches, where the country's pulse beat loudest. In Akron, Ohio, the clang of machinery filled a tire plant as workers crowded into the break room, grease on their hands, steel dust on their boots. A battered TV in the corner replayed Obama's voice. History isn't written by cynics, it's written by those who keep pushing, even when the odds are against them. One man scoffed, shoving his sandwich back into its wrapper. Pretty speeches don't put food on the table. Across from him, a younger worker shot back. Maybe not, but it keeps us from forgetting why the fight matters. The room buzzed with tension, pride, and skepticism colliding in the hum of fluorescent lights. In a Chicago high school, a civics teacher wheeled in a projector cart, the hum of the fan filling the silence before the clip began. Students leaned back in their chairs, restless at first, but as Obama's cadence rolled across the room, even the class clown fell silent. His words carried weight, not like a lecture, but like a challenge. Our democracy survives because millions refuse to give up on one another. A girl in the back whispered, "It sounds like he's talking to us." Pen-scratched phones lifted to record, and for once the chatter of adolescence gave way to something deeper, the realization that they were part of the story, not just watching it. On Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama, the church pews filled with the smell of perfume, pressed suits, and whispered prayers. A pastor, gripping the edges of his pulpit, paused mid-sermon and cued the recording through the sound system. Obama's voice rose through the rafters, threading into stained glass light. "We don't move forward by tearing each other down. We move forward by lifting one another up." Amens rippled through the congregation, hands shot skyward, and for a moment the sermon belonged not to the pastor, but to a voice that reminded them of dignity. Yet even there outside the church doors, arguments brewed. Some dismissed it as manipulation, others carried it like scripture. The divide was raw, visible in every reaction. In factories, it was grit against hope. In classrooms, it was skepticism, bowing reluctantly to possibility. In churches, it was faith meeting politics and struggling to separate them. Everywhere the tape played, the same clash, unfolded voices, hardened by disappointment, against voices softened by remembrance. But beneath the arguments, a fragile thread of pride lingered. Pride that someone still spoke in a way that felt larger than politics. Pride that even if only for a moment the country stopped to listen. And as skepticism gnawed at the edges, the deeper truth pulsed through every break room, classroom, and sanctuary the words had landed, and America could no longer pretend it hadn't heard them. The words didn't just echo through news cycles, they mutated, reborn in the bloodstream of American culture. A DJ in Atlanta sampled Obama's voice into a pulsing beat. The line, "Leadership isn't volume, it's listening," dropping like thunder over a bass line that rattled club walls. On TikTok, teenagers stitched the recording into slow-motion reels of basketball practice, hospital night shifts, even proposals in candlelit diners. Millions watched, millions shared, and the clip that began as political ammunition was now a soundtrack to ordinary lives. In Los Angeles, a fitness influencer filmed a sunrise run along the beach, earbuds tucked in Obama's cadence layered over the crashing waves. The reel exploded overnight, captioned, "Strength isn't about tearing down, it's about lifting up." In Houston, a motivational speaker used the recording as the backdrop for a graduation montage, tassels flying in slow arcs as the words, "Our democracy survives because millions refuse to give up," poured over cheering crowds. The internet turned the tape into scripture, not just quoted, but lived spliced into every corner of digital existence until it no longer belonged to one man or even one moment. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, a street mural bloomed across a brick wall, spray-painted letters spelling strength in words. Strangers paused, phones raised as Obama's face emerged in layered colors, his quotes looping in the captions of every post that followed. Across the street, a skeptic muttered, "It's just branding." But the group of kids snapping selfies in front of it didn't care. They only knew the words felt bigger than politics, bigger than the fight that birthed them. Even late-night talk shows couldn't resist. A comedian played the clip behind him, then smirked. Trump tried to play a villain's monologue, but America heard a motivational ad. The audience erupted, the laughter spilling into applause, and the words surged once more into cultural oxygen. It wasn't satire that kept it alive. It was resonance and energy people wanted to replay because it reminded them of something they'd been starving for: steadiness. The backfire had become more than a headline. It was now a movement without a leader, carried by DJs, teachers, influencers, and strangers who found meaning where none was supposed to exist. The recording was no longer an artifact of political war. It was a mirror of how deeply people long to feel connected, even if only through a voice on repeat. And as the remix videos and motivational reels multiplied, the deeper questions settled like fog over the country. Do we choose leaders for their policies or for the way they make us feel about ourselves? The Oval Office no longer felt like the seat of power. It felt like a furnace, and Donald Trump was the fire raging at its center. He stormed across the carpet in jagged lines, his shoes slamming into the floor with the rhythm of a war drum. The television on the wall replayed the same 7 minutes again and again. Obama's calm voice, his measured tone, his words already remixed into cultural oxygen, and each repetition seemed to slice deeper into Trump's pride. His tie hung loose, his collar damp with sweat, his face crimson beneath the bright ceiling lights. He spun toward the screen, fist raised, and shouted, "I showed proof, and they crowned him instead." The outburst cracked through the Oval Office like a gunshot, rattling aides who didn't dare breathe too loudly. Papers fluttered on the resolute desk as Trump slammed both palms down, veins bulging in his neck. "This was supposed to be the kill shot," he roared, his voice cracking on the last word. The words were meant to intimidate, but they carried something more dangerous: paranoia laced with desperation. His staff exchanged glances, their silence louder than any protest. Phones in their pockets vibrated with fresh alerts, polling spikes for Obama hashtags cresting into the millions, late-night monologues sharpening the knife. Each buzz was another nail hammered into the coffin of control, and they all knew it. Trump wheeled around, his eyes wild, darting from aide to aide, as though searching for the traitor who had sabotaged him. "They're twisting it," he growled, the words spilling fast. "They'll make him a saint, and they'll bury me." His reflection in the window caught his attention. Sweaty, furious, trembling with rage, and even that seemed to mock him. He grabbed a stack of notes from the desk and hurled them across the room, pages scattering like feathers, settling at the feet of men and women, too afraid to bend down and collect them. One aide finally dared to speak, his voice steady but quiet. "Sir, maybe we need to shift the narrative frame. It has interference as overreach." The suggestion fell dead in the air. Trump snapped his head toward him, eyes blazing, and shouted, "No weakness! That's what this is. They're making weakness look like strength." His tone was brittle, every word thinner than the last, a match burning down to its own fingers. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the muffled sound of Obama's voice still playing on a muted TV in the corner, soft, steady, unshakable. Trump turned back to the desk, gripping its edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We'll drown him out," he muttered, more to himself than to the room. "Flood the networks. Spin it harder, louder." But even as the words left his lips, he knew the truth, clawing beneath them. The louder he shouted, the smaller he sounded. His power wasn't leaking in a single moment. It was bleeding out, drip by drip, every time Obama's voice played again. And as the Oval Office sank into silence, the truth lingered like smoke after a fire. Donald Trump hadn't buried his rival. He had resurrected him. While the Oval Office smoldered with Trump's fury, whispers were already spreading through Washington's marble corridors and Manhattan's gilded fundraiser halls. Behind closed doors, the moneymen who had fueled his rise leaned across polished tables, their voices low but sharp. "The optics are terrible," one muttered, swirling his drink without taking a sip. Another, face tight with frustration, hissed, "We handed Democrats a gift." The clink of ice in crystal glasses couldn't drown the panic pulsing in their words. In a private club off Park Avenue, donors who once bragged about proximity to power now studied their phones like grim autopsy reports. Numbers scrolled across their screens, polls flashing upward, arrows next to Obama's name, downward ones beside Trump's. "We can't afford mistakes like this," one financier said, pressing his palm to his forehead. "We buy certainty, not blunders." For the first time, silence followed, not the comfortable pause of wealth, but the uneasy quiet of men calculating escape routes. On Capitol Hill, Republican lawmakers huddled in shadowed corners, ducking cameras and dodging reporters' questions. They whispered their fears in cloakrooms and late-night text threads, the words etched with betrayal. He gave them oxygen, one senator admitted, his voice hushed, as though the walls themselves might betray him. Another, younger and less practiced at hiding panic, muttered, "We'll be the ones paying for this. Every debate, every campaign, stop, they'll play that tape." The acknowledgement was bitter, but none denied it. In committee rooms, aides shuffled folders, their hands slick with sweat, while their bosses fumed in whispers too quiet for microphones. Some spoke of doubling down, attacking harder, framing Obama as meddling in national affairs. But most knew the truth. The clip didn't sound like interference. It sounded like leadership. The irony was unbearable. They had come to destroy an image, and instead they had burnished it to gold. At a fundraiser in Dallas, the mood curdled into open anger. One oil magnate leaned across the table, jabbing a finger at a fellow donor. "We invested millions to push strength, and now he makes us look like fools." His companion, older and wearier, simply shook his head. "He doesn't know the difference between fire and gasoline," he said, voice low with contempt. "And we're the ones choking on the smoke." Fear threaded through every whispered conversation. Fear that the money would dry up. Fear that suburban voters already restless would turn away for good. Fear that one misstep had turned into a wound that wouldn't heal before the next election. In private, they admitted what none dared say aloud in front of cameras. "We handed Democrats a gift, and we can't take it back." The betrayal cut both ways. Donors felt used, lawmakers felt cornered, and all of them wondered how much longer they could afford to defend a man who seemed determined to destroy himself. In the shadows of Washington and the boardrooms of New York, the same thought circled like a vulture overhead. Maybe the real backfire wasn't the tape itself. It was that they were still tethered to the man who played it. By the time midnight rolled across the coast, the storm had shifted from outrage to ridicule. On late-night stages bathed in neon comedians sharpened the moment into daggers of irony. One host leaned toward his camera, grin wide, and delivered the line that would loop through social media before sunrise. Trump tried to play a scary movie but hit the motivational playlist instead. The studio erupted in laughter, a wave of relief and mockery crashing together, sealing the narrative not with anger, but with humor that cut even deeper. Clips of the monologue exploded across Twitter and TikTok, comedians' punchlines stitched over the same loop of Obama's calm voice. Audiences howled, replaying the irony on loop. The president who had sought to bury his rival was now the butt of the biggest joke in the country. Satire didn't just sting, it amplified, turning failure into farce. And every laugh was another nail in the coffin of control, another reminder that once a story escaped, it was no longer his to command. While the nation laughed, pollsters worked through the night, their screens flickering with numbers climbing like rockets. By dawn, the results landed with the weight of an earthquake. Obama's favorability had jumped 5 points, nationally surging even higher among independents and younger voters. Analysts on morning shows leaned over gleaming desks, their voices hushed with awe. "You don't see spikes like this overnight," one remarked, tapping the chart. This wasn't damage control, it was resurrection. The irony was merciless, the graphs as sharp as any headline. In diners across Ohio and Michigan, bleary-eyed workers sipped coffee while television anchors replayed the fresh data. The barista in Detroit muttered 5 points in a night. "That's not politics, that's a pulse." Even skeptics couldn't deny the shockwave. Numbers didn't lie, and these numbers told a story of a man reanimated by the very hand that tried to silence him. For Trump's allies, the figures were suffocating proof that the mistake had metastasized. For his enemies, it was vindication wrapped in data. Inside the West Wing, the laughter from television screens was salt in the wound. Trump's aides shuffled in silence, their faces drained, while the president himself prowled the halls like a wounded predator. He dismissed the polls as fake, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the truth. Denial could not erase numbers plastered across every network, every feed, every conversation in America. The more he raged, the smaller he looked beside the calm that now defined his rival. The backfire was complete mockery in the midnight hours, data at dawn. What began as a political strike had become a cultural spectacle, one that no press release or angry tweet could smother. And as laughter bled into shock, the country was left staring at the unshakable irony etched into the moment. Can you ever control the meaning of words once they belong to the people? By morning, the conversation no longer belonged to politicians or pundits, it belonged to the people. In a diner outside Wichita, Kansas, 4 men in baseball caps leaned over their plates of eggs and bacon, their voices colliding like hammers on steel. One slammed his mug down so hard the coffee spilled over the rim. "He's trying to sound noble, but it's all control," he barked. Across from him, an older farmer shook his head, stirring his black coffee slow. Maybe he muttered, or maybe he's just telling us to believe in each other. The table fell silent for a moment, not in agreement, but in the kind of pause that meant the words had sunk in. On the subway in Boston, the morning commute was a crush of bodies, phones glowing in every hand. A young woman hit play on the clip, the calm cadence of Obama's voice, cutting through the screech of metal on tracks. Strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, grew, still some, closing their eyes as the line echoed. Leadership isn't volume, it's listening. A construction worker with a hard hat in his lap nodded faintly, whispering, "Wish we heard more of that." No one answered, but the silence wasn't dismissal. It was reluctant respect, strangers united in a rare moment of collective listening. In Albuquerque, a group of veterans gathered in a smoky VFW hall, the televisions flickering with replay after replay of the tape. Their voices were rough-weathered by time and war, but their arguments cut sharp. "I don't trust him," one growled, stabbing a finger at the screen. "Never did." Another younger leaned back in his chair and exhaled slow. "Maybe not," he said, "but listen to the way the country's reacting. They're hearing a commander, not a politician." The room grew heavy, each man staring at his beer, wrestling with truths they didn't want to admit. The tension was everywhere: lunch counters, barbershops, classrooms after the final bell. Some voices spat cynicism, insisting it was all theater. Others, softer but no less powerful, admitted the words stirred something they hadn't felt in years. Respect, reluctant and raw, threaded through the skepticism like cracks of light under a locked door. America wasn't agreeing, but it was listening. And in that rare pause stretched across diners, subway cars, and smoky halls, the nation revealed its own paradox, torn between distrust and longing, suspicion and hope. The debate was messy, unfiltered, alive. For once the noise wasn't drowning out the moment, it was the moment. And through it all, the question lingered like smoke after a fire: had they just heard weakness, or the kind of strength they'd been missing all along? The words that began as a political weapon now pulsed through the veins of a new generation. In high school gymnasiums draped with banners and folding chairs, students stood at podiums with trembling hands, tassels swaying as they spoke. Again and again, the same lines surfaced in their speeches. History isn't written by cynics, it's written by those who keep pushing even when the odds are against them. Parents wiped their eyes not because of politics, but because their children were seizing the moment as their own, turning it into a promise for the future. Locker rooms buzzed with the energy of borrowed conviction. In Cleveland, a basketball coach scrawled on the whiteboard before the state finals, "Leadership isn't volume, it's listening." His players gathered around, sweaty and restless. But when he pointed to the words, the room stilled. "This is how you lead each other," he told them, tapping the board with the marker. Phones lit up as the players posted the quote to Instagram, tagging it with fire emojis and hashtags that spread faster than the scoreboard ever could. By the time they took the court, the phrase had become more than a lesson. It was a battle cry. College campuses, too, hummed with the same rhythm. At the University of Michigan, a student newspaper ran an editorial titled "Strength in Words," written by a sophomore who hadn't even been old enough to vote during Obama's presidency. "We're tired of being told to stay quiet," she wrote. "We're claiming the message: persistence, patience, belief in each other." Her piece went viral overnight, printed out and taped to dorm room doors, passed around like a manifesto. For students drowning in cynicism, the tape became an anchor, proof that language still mattered. Even churches and community centers felt the shift. Youth groups recited the lines as call and response, their voices ringing out beneath stained glass and flickering fluorescent lights alike. Teachers assigned essays on the meaning of the tape, not to analyze politics, but to ask, "What kind of leader do you want to be?" The answers poured in, raw and unpolished, filled with dreams of service, change, and resilience. These weren't echoes of the past. They were blueprints for the future, drafted by voices not yet old enough to forget hope. Hope itself became the emotional beat threading it all together. For once, young people weren't just spectators of a political moment. They were its inheritors, lifting words from the wreckage of a backfire and turning them into fuel. What began as an Oval Office miscalculation had morphed into a generational shift as teenagers and 20-somethings claimed the message not as nostalgia, but as direction. And across gyms, campuses, and graduation stages, one truth pulsed louder than cynicism itself. The youth weren't just listening, they were answering. As America argued in diners, classrooms, and locker rooms, the rest of the world watched with fascination. European newspapers splashed the story across their front pages. Obama's second act, declared Le Monde, while Der Spiegel ran a cover showing a split screen, Trump scowling, Obama speaking with the caption, "Strength Reimagined." In London, commentators on the BBC marveled at the irony, calling it the sharpest political backfire of the decade. The image of calm words outshining rage was irresistible to a continent weary of noise in its own politics. North of the border, Canadian broadcasters couldn't contain their astonishment. Trump amplifies rival one headline read the subtext, clear he had handed his opponent the loudest microphone in the world. Talk shows replayed the clip with reverence, their panels less concerned with partisanship than with tone. This wasn't strategy, a Toronto anchor said. This was sincerity, and sincerity travels. Across living rooms from Vancouver to Halifax, the tape wasn't just news, it was a reminder of what they once admired about America. Even further afield, headlines in Asia and Africa framed the moment not as a clash but as a lesson. Commentators in Japan noted the cultural paradox, a leader known for brashness undone by a rival's restraint. In Nairobi, a columnist wrote, "The voice of calm travels farther than the roar of anger." Global social feeds stitched the tape into montages of resilience. Farmers, students, volunteers, underscoring that the words had transcended politics, becoming universal. Through every headline, every broadcast, a single question began to circle the globe like a shadow does history. Remember those who shout loudest, or those who steady the room? Weeks passed, but the words refused to fade. Families at dinner tables still repeated them like a refrain, teenagers quoting lines between bites of pizza, while their parents nodded in reluctant agreement. In workplaces, the tape lived on in break rooms, where workers argued between shifts, one insisting it was empty rhetoric, another saying it was the first time in years they felt reminded of something larger than paychecks and deadlines. The arguments were raw, but the words had lodged themselves too deep to be ignored. Teachers carried the message into classrooms, chalking quotes on blackboards, asking students what leadership meant in their own lives. Some laughed, others wrote thoughtful essays, but the discussion never stalled. It stretched, grew, refused to die. In Philadelphia, one civics teacher taped a simple printout to her wall. "Leadership isn't volume, it's listening." Weeks later, the paper was wrinkled, but the ink had become a quiet banner in the room, a reminder that tone had outlived the fury that tried to erase it. Even in churches and community centers, the echo endured. Pastors wove the words into sermons, not as politics, but as scripture for endurance, while local leaders used them to inspire volunteers. In a small-town library, a retired veteran leaned over to a group of high schoolers and recited the line from memory, his voice cracking not from age, but from conviction. They listened not because of who first spoke it, but because it sounded like something worth keeping. What had begun as a failed strike had become something rarer, a legacy of tone over volume. The fury had burned hot and fast, but the calm had lingered steady as a heartbeat. And in every family debate, every classroom chalkboard, every whispered conversation in the corners of America, the same truth pulsed quietly. Sometimes the loudest legacy is the one spoken softly enough to be remembered. In the weeks that followed, the tape stopped being about Obama. It became a mirror held up to Trump. Every replay carried a double image, one man calm, steady, speaking of neighbors and hope. The other, red-faced fists clenched, desperate to twist meaning out of words that refused to bend. Commentators no longer debated the substance of the clip. They debated the contrast, the way the attack revealed more about the attacker than the target. On cable panels, analysts spoke with a tone bordering on pity. This wasn't Obama's victory, one said it was Trump's undoing. The irony was unbearable, in trying to frame his rival as unfit, Trump had instead framed himself impulsive, paranoid, unwilling to see how his fury only magnified the calm across from him. The moment no longer belonged to Obama's speech. It belonged to Trump's mistake, a permanent scar etched into the theater of American politics. Among ordinary citizens, the recognition grew sharper. In diners and break rooms, people shook their heads not at Obama's words, but at Trump's reaction. "He gave him the stage," a factory worker muttered, "and then showed us all he couldn't handle it." Even skeptics who distrusted both men found themselves acknowledging the imbalance one voice had steadied a room the other had shattered under its own weight. The morale was no longer hidden, it was plain for all to see, and so the attack became its own indictment. History would not remember the fury as proof of strength, but as the evidence of fragility. The contrast lingered like smoke in the air, impossible to ignore, forcing the nation to reflect perhaps true leadership isn't revealed in the blows we throw, but in how we stand when the storm passes. Time passed and the frenzy began to dim. The hashtags fell from the trending lists, the late-night punchlines softened, and the television panels moved on to the next crisis. But what lingered wasn't the noise. It was the tone, the calm steadiness of a voice that had refused to shout. In the quiet after the storm, Americans realized that what they remembered most wasn't the clash, but the contrast. In small towns and big cities alike, fragments of the tape lived on in unexpected ways. A mother repeated the words to her child at bedtime. A coach taped them above a locker room door. A teacher whispered them to herself before stepping into a noisy classroom. Strength had been redefined not as domination, but as presence, an enduring reminder that leadership could steady rather than shatter. For Trump, the fury faded into memory. For Obama, the calm carried forward like a pulse that refused to die. The true lesson was not about politics, but about people, the way words could make them pause, argue hope, and remember who they were to each other. Noise had its moment, but truth softly spoken had claimed its place in memory. And so the moral revealed itself in the simplest of terms. Strength isn't proven by calling others unfit, it's proven by reminding people why they matter. The question that lingered, whispered across kitchen tables and subway cars alike, was timeless in your life. Do you trust the loudest voice or the clearest truth? In life, true strength isn't found in shouting louder than others. It's found in choosing words that steady encourage and remind people of their worth. This story shows us that calm truth endures long after noise fades. For those of us over 50, it's a reminder that experience brings wisdom, and wisdom speaks best when it lifts others up. Your voice, steady and sincere, can shape the world around you, family, friends, community. This week, instead of raising your voice in frustration, can you use your voice to remind someone why they matter? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.